We're now going to take a quick tour through how to implement the client-related classes. We don't have to spend a lot of time on this because we walk through most of it in the other slides, but I just want to give you a sense of how the pieces work together and what it looks like from a code point of view as opposed to a slide point of view. So this is what's going to use the HTTP interface client features of Spring, modern Spring, in order to generate the proxies and make the calls. And you can find that in the client folder, in my EX3 project, in the WebFlux folder, in the Live Lessons GitHub repository. So here we are in the client in the EX3 project. Let's go take a look at this. A couple things to note here. We have a common folder which contains stuff like the client beans class, which has the quote API bean that will be used to make a quote API object. We've looked at this before. It's very similar to what we talked about before. We also, of course, have the quote class. We've talked about that before. You'll notice here that this is pretty simple. We are going to make this be something that can be used in order to have the ID of the quote and the string of the quote. So that's what's going to be received back from the client. And you'll notice, by the way, this is probably something that's worth noting because otherwise you get yourself into trouble if you don't realize this. You'll notice there's also a quote here in common. And the quote in common is annotated to be an entity that can work with either the Jakarta Persistence API or R2DBC. So this is what we use on the server side, and it's common between the Handy microservice and the Zippy microservice. However, on the client side, we don't want to have the version of quote that's got all this entity annotation stuff on it, because that will confuse the client, and it'll think that it needs to treat this persistently. So instead, we have a much simpler quote class, which is not an entity. It's just got an ID and a quote. And that's actually what will be sent and then received back from the client. And on the server side, the other quote is used internally in order to be able to do the persistence. So very important thing to realize, if you try to use the quote from here on the client side, you will have a world of hurt and you'll get very weird linking errors and so on. Okay, let's go take a look at the client itself. So you can see we have the quote API, which, as we saw before, is just this HTTP interface client feature from Spring 6 and beyond, where we can declaratively specify all the different proxy methods using annotations that are expected by Spring HTTP interface, like get exchange and post exchange, which are the equivalent to get mapping and post mapping on the controller. These route names are very similar, except we put the route name here because we're going to use dynamic path routing that we talked about in order to be able to put in the appropriate microservice name when we invoke the method passing in the appropriate microservice. So we get all quotes, which takes that path variable to do dynamic path routing. Here we have post quotes, which takes the route name followed by the list of quote IDs. We have search, which takes the route name followed by the list of string queries. And then we have the other one that is going to use to do the anding for the custom SQL method. So nothing really surprising there. Here's the quote client. We arguably could get rid of quote client and just have the test driver go ahead and auto-wire the quote API. I just did it this way for consistency with my other examples. We auto-wire the quote API, and then you can see here when you make the calls, you pass the route name in, and you forward that to the proxy method along with other parameters, and it'll put that route name in the get or post request, so the gateway will then route it to the appropriate microservice on the receiver side. And there's a couple other things here that we'll talk about when we get further into the quote driver, but that's going to come in the next part of the lesson. So that's basically what the client proxy portion of this code looks like.